Can you tell us a bit about what it is that you do as a designer and a director, and kind of how that ends up in the work that we see here?
Yeah. A little bit about myself. I trained as I studied studio art at Yale with a concentration in graphic design, and I thought always I actually wanted to go into children's books, and still maybe someday I might. I love the way images moved with words and narrative, and you can make and sequencing and the story and all those ideas. And so that led me into doing my senior project, which was an animated alphabet book. And I totally got hooked on film and video. And I think it was the idea of like being able to put everything that you create and sequence it in in the computer. It's almost like the computer is a big collage box, and that's what I really enjoy about it. My first job out of school was being an animator for the show Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? And
right, everyone knows it.
And which was for WGBH television in Boston, and like I said, that totally got me hooked on the whole video world. I then went to Los Angeles afterwards to work at our Greenberg Associates, which was really well known for doing film titles at the time. All is a roundabout way to say that I like using my design skills to concept ideas for the screen. So whether it be a title design, which involves working with the film's director usually, and either watching a cut of the film, or if it hasn't been shot yet, reading a script and concepting ideas and doing a storyboard, and then taking it from there to either animation or shooting it. That's what I like to do. I work with always. I want you to know these projects are extremely collaborative. I work with teams both big and small. But I'm, as the director, the creative lead of that, but it's very collaborative, whether I'm working with a team of animators or a crew for shooting. And the process is very similar to doing a commercial, which is, after all, sometimes a way of condensing a brand, a story, or a bigger, idea or feeling, or a bigger brand into like 30 seconds or 60 seconds. I think I like to think of metaphors, to express storytelling.
So, you went and studied this kind of stuff at school.
Mm-hmm.
What were you like when you were younger? Did you always want to work in a visual medium? I mean, you're talking about, taking these big ideas and distilling them down. I mean, did you unpack your parents' arguments and sort of, I got it all worked out? Like, what were you like as a kid, and how did it lead there?
I like to make things as a kid. I think probably everybody here probably was the kid who could draw, or who would, you were just making things. I was making books all the time, little books for little fake newspapers for my family to have subscriptions to. At the time, when I started animating, it was, even in elementary school, I remember doing experiments with my dad's Super 8 camera, and you would cut paper, very much like South Park, which we'll come back and talk about later. But so like little cut pieces of paper, and you'd shoot it, and one frame at a time. You get your hand in, and and you make a ball bounce like that. And I didn't have actually editing equipment at the time, which limits you. But I would do little animated films, and I just thought animation always was magical in a way. Just to be able to make a drawing move, or a bit of paper, turn into something. So I think I was always, making things. I always knew I wanted to study art. That was always, I have a report from when I was in 6th grade, and it's like, I want to be a commercial artist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow, at least you had the business mind of worked out there.
I knew I liked, I actually wanted to be, my dream when I was in high school was like to be a greeting card artist. Yeah. Like, I wanted to, I think I liked the idea of something mass produced that a lot of people could enjoy.
Right.
And, then the internet came along, so.
Changed everything. Well, let's move on to some of your work. The first piece we're going to show is kind of an interesting kind of juxtaposition. You wanted to have things that everyone saw, yet one of the first pieces we have here was a little bit more of a niche, lesser known film from MTV, correct? It's
not by design, probably.
Well, no, but it was a nice narrative segue.
She's good. She's a writer.
Dead Man on Campus. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to see here, and then we can talk about it in depth afterwards?
Yeah, this was one of the first title sequences I headed the design of, and it's still one of my favorites. I think it's because my partner and I on this, Adam Blooming, were able to write all these jokes. And so just a little bit about designing for a comedy. It's really important when you're designing a title for a comedy that you get people laughing right away. You want to give people the license to laugh. And in this particular comedy, it's kind of a strange subject matter. We're linking suicide with school. Basically,
Hilarity.
yeah. I don't know. I don't know if this is something at your schools, but this was an urban myth at mine, where if you had a roommate and they committed suicide, you would get straight A's for the term because
this is not suggestion, by the way.
Because of all the emotional duress. Luckily, I didn't, ever see this. Nobody had to test this and this rule. But anyway, the premise of this film is that the two guys who are kind of flunking out of school have to find the most suicide guy on campus to room with them and thus save their, academics. So, a little suicide, a little, college humor. It's kind of, so how do you link those things? And I think that's what I really like about designing titles, or sometimes you get, or commercials, is you get, these kind of disparate things and you have to link them together.
Okay, let's on that
yes.
note, show the clip.
I found it worrisome when I was working on the project that the editor actually asked for the one where the head was in the oven, but
Okay, you get to choose one of these modes of death. Go.
And then I met the writer years ago for another project, and he said, "You gave me that boring one with the fill in the blanks." Very political titles sometimes.
So you were starting to talk about unpacking this design problem, and it is a very delicate one in a way. I mean, suicide is not a light topic, but we've got a dark comedy based on this. Can you take us through a little bit of that process, that design process?
Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge to think of something, that would link all these things. So, actually, one of my favorite ideas was the idea of, hiding the credits in the sequence. So I don't know if you know that one of my favorite title sequences of all time is the one for Delicatessen, which is an amazing one where the camera goes around this tabletop and the director of photography's credit is on the camera, and then there's an old record, and that's the music credit. And so I always like this idea of finding these little Easter eggs in the title sequence. My favorite idea was actually like a cheat sheet. Like you'd find, a name here, or maybe we'd film something and their name would be on a bottom of the shoe or a piece of paper, but that doesn't get the suicide aspect in. And we're brainstorming some more, and maybe it was about college acceptance letters. Like everybody was going to the mailbox and getting a letter, and the last one would be a letter bomb, but that's not very funny. So, it's like this guy. So it's like what I usually start with a design process of brainstorming, and often looking at writing down ideas. In this case, I did storyboards with my team. Drawn storyboard of the mailbox one. We did the cheat sheet one, and then we mocked up a textbook one very similar to this. And then we thought, oh, why do I have a textbook? Let's make it like an SAT. And then, it's a collaboration with the filmmakers. You go and you sometimes it will show one idea, something, that is struck, seems immediate. But sometimes, as in this case, there will be a couple ideas of approaches, and then we'll either fine tune with that storyboards and then go into production. And it kind of, film is an organic thing, as you know. All during this time they're working at the film, you're usually doing this during the editorial process, and things can change around. As you know, whole endings of movies have changed during the editorial process. So, it's a little bit of finding your way with the filmmakers.
And music is really interesting in this one as well. I mean, that was a cover. I mean, looking at the music supervision credits, you're just like, some awesome people on that. But it was a cover.
Yes, Marilyn Manson doing a cover of David Bowie's Golden Years, which is great because we actually had access to do a remake or to do some things with music. We were toying around. There was a great remake of I Will Survive, Gloria Gaynor's song by, who did that? Cake had done that. That was up in the running. But we wanted, I always love the idea of, taking something older and making a twist on it, a cover artist, or just finding something to juxtapose with it. As we go through the reel, you'll see. I always joke that music does 80% of the work.
Well, let's not sell yourself short. When we were talking before this event, you mentioned that this piece in particular you're very fond of, and that it kind of defined you as a designer. In what ways?
I think the idea being, I consider myself a very conceptual designer, that I'm always thinking of sort of the story. First, I ever since I was young, or I still enjoy, I enjoy terrible puns, horrible puns. Everybody expects them from me. They're corny, they're bad. I do corny visual puns as well as verbal ones, and that was a great, one to show off that talent, if you call it that. But I enjoyed writing it with Adam, my partner on this job. I felt like the idea. What I really enjoy about titles is that space to do something that can be. Cecil Bass was the inspiration for all of us who would follow, but something different from the film. It like complements the film, but it doesn't duplicate the film. And I think that idea of creating a little nugget of something that is a completely unique to the film, but not the same thing as the visual language of the film, is something that I try to bring to a lot of my title designs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this next clip we're going to show includes two films. We've got Bedazzled from 2000 and Definitely Maybe from 2008. Can you tell us a little bit about why you put these two pieces together?
Yeah, I these are separated by 8 years, but they have sort of similar themes. They both detail a character. They pull out a character, and they both detail. One is going to work, and the other coming from work. So very similar themes. Both involved live action shoots with the principal photography. And so was able, and that's always really nice when you have the opportunity, you're early enough in the process that you can work with the filmmakers to do a special shoot to do something that rolls right into the story of the film. I guess we could talk about it a little bit more after we see them, right? But you'll see some similarities. I can talk a little bit more about, one of the functions of a title sequence is to set up a character, and that's one of the most enjoyable challenges to work on when you're doing one of these.
So let's roll that clip, please.
I forgot to mention in that last one, I put one of the shots I put myself in.
Oh yeah, I was going to look for that.
Yes, a little Hitchcock moment.
Amazing. So you mentioned these both are bound by the idea of defining a character. Can you start with Bedazzled and Brendan Fraser and sort of tell us a bit about what that film is, what that character was, and how that piece really kind of brought that idea to bear?
Yeah, so the film's about the Elizabeth Hurley, who plays the devil. She wants to find
naturally
stretch, wants to find the most susceptible guy to make a bargain for his soul. So if she's looking for the most gullible person, and so it's kind of like this devil vision. We concept of this as a sort of a devil vision of the world. And so she wants to find somebody insecure, clearly, because if you're confident and have faith and and are in a good place, you're not going to be making a deal with the devil. So she's looking for somebody who's insecure and lonely, and thus is all this is a worldwide search that finally filters down to Brendan Fraser. And then we obviously do this kind of mock interface of these little pop-ups, to kind of see her understanding of people's internal conditions. And then we single him out during a shoot in San Francisco, where he walks at a different pace than everybody else. So she's like kind of honing in on him. And one of the incredibly fun things about that shoot is working with Brendan Fraser and Harold Ramis on that shoot. Brendan is an incredible physical comic, and he is almost like a mime. And so he is able to, what he did was he walked, everybody else walked, these hundreds of extras, we walked at normal pace, and he would walk really slowly. But, that's really hard to do
naturally.
So the idea is then when we speed up when we play the footage, everybody else looks like a blur, but he actually, you can see him out of the crowd. And it was kind of like an in-camera kind of special effect that we had done. You can do this now. I've actually just recently done this for you'll see actually in Boardwalk Empire, there's elements of this, but I've seen commercials and done it myself where you actually take two plates, you shoot them at different speeds, and and then you composite them together, or you put them together, layer them together in the computer. But we didn't do that. There's so much with him actually among the crowd, and with so much in front of him, and in the actual picture, that we thought it was better to actually shoot some of those shots, even though they're kind of quirky when he moves in camera. And we did actually do plates at the end when he's at the door, but. That helped just to find him when he's going to work, as why you're following him, and you get a little bit of his backstory through this title sequence.
How much fun did you have with all of the little pop-ups?
It's great because like we did 2 shoots, one a big one with the principal photography, then our own shoot where I didn't manage to put myself in that one, but like half of my, the people in their studio are in, and so the people at the bar or the skateboarder or some of those other extras of going through the street are people that just we work with that basically are cheap. So, but then we would,
There's the secret of how you get it done. Friends.
You still have to do that, even professionally. I'm sorry to say. Everybody's very sure, once you work for major films and this doesn't happen and you don't have to kind of do it guerrilla style, but sometimes you do. Same with the same thing with Definitely Maybe, a totally different story. He is just got served his divorce papers. So it's a really lousy day, but he loves going to pick up his daughter at school. So this is his walk through New York and establishing where he lives. And it was great for me. It was like my first title sequence after moving to New York for 8 years. I'm now back in Los Angeles, but I moved in 2005 to New York City, and it was this kind of great introduction to go through the city and shoot it like that. The director, Adam Brooks, was a New York, a true New Yorker and wanted very true to the city. He didn't want to feel like, somebody could pick out, that's that's really the East Village, and it wouldn't connect to the Upper West Side where he would be going. So it was just plotted this whole thing, and we called up friends to be people in the park to come up to him or arguing on the street. And there's a kid skateboarding that we had to chase down his mom. We're like, that's perfect. We gotta run after him and get a waiver. So some of the things were found, as the serendipity of like shooting, and then some we had extras or friends, pass in the street and kind of make this sort of hopefully natural feeling of walking through New York City.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned with the last clip that music does 80% of the work, and we laughed at that. But both of these pieces are very defined by music. How involved as a title designer are you in the choice of music?
That varies, but we usually because music is such a part of the mood. Actually, in the ones you just saw, Bedazzled and Definitely Maybe, the animators on each team actually found each track. So we always when you're working on a film, you're working with either the film's composer or the film's music supervisor, and hopefully you're finding a track or having something composed to picture. Often, that track hasn't been picked yet while we're starting our creative process, and sometimes you want to choose something that might be, that you think that should be the pace and the mood. So the animator on Bedazzled, for instance, Jeff Jenkins, found that kind of country song, and it was great because we were looking for lyrics. I always love it when lyrics kind of complement the picture in some way, and just the one I've been looking for kind of express the devil in sort of an unexpected mood. And it's funny, after we put that on, we're doing a search with the music supervisor, and somebody suggested maybe techno would be better because it's really fast-paced with all these like time-lapse things, but it totally changed the mood, and it wasn't funny anymore. It was really kind of intense, it was much more it totally didn't make it a comedy anymore. And we came back to that, and they actually licensed that piece, even though we had just done it as a temp track. And then for the extremely important, because, and Definitely Maybe, the whole idea is like, he's in this bubble, it's like you're walking to work, you've got your earbuds in, and like, he doesn't hear, it's like he's in a movie, it's like you see the picture and you're hearing the music and that's all you have. And so it's really important because he found this perfect song to find the perfect song. And actually, our editor was the one who found the first rap song to make the joke. When we suggested the joke that maybe he's got this nasty song first, especially if he got the divorce papers, then he gets into this groovy sort of everyday people. And then it ended up being the song that they used for that one too. So we were really instrumental in those two.
So both of them were the temp tracks you used while just editing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then
which can be challenging sometimes, right? If you fall in love with a song, but then you can't license it?
Yeah. There are times when you fall in love with the song and can't license it, or, in a better situation, it's like you have a temp track, and then, then when the composer, the music super gets, works with you, there's either a better one or the composer can do something very custom to your picture, which is also very nice. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's just truly for tempo and just mood, and we'll get something better. But often, at the same time, if you find something great during your search, during the temp, it can become the real thing. So it's just, it's always just listening to the work and seeing what's best for the picture. And often we'll throw on, I would recommend this for any of your work if you're working on a piece. edit to something, but then for kicks, throw on something else and see how it changes. Because sometimes you think that you did all this edit work, and that could only go with this piece of music, and you throw something else on, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Now I pay more attention to this or to that just because the soundtrack changed. And I think it's an incredible part of the design process. So, use it that way. Use it as a tool.
Mm-hmm. So those two pieces were about defining characters that were living specifically within the world of those films. And so the work you did really kind of set the stage for them. These next two pieces are quite different in that they are well-known cultural institutions, I suppose you could call them, in terms of well-known pieces. I guess let's just go right into showing them. These next two pieces are The Cat in the Hat and The Pink Panther 2. So could we play that clip, please? So these are, like I mentioned, really different because they're working on legacy brands. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between creating a title for a wholly new concept or characters versus something that everyone for generations is quite familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, there is a particular set of challenges when you do a sequel, or you do, take on characters everybody knows and loves, and there's a built-in audience, and already people are familiar. The Cat in the Hat is an interesting study in that our original idea for this was completely different. We had if you know this film, it's a live action film, it's not an animated film, and the director Bo Welch and the production designer Alex McDowell made an amazing built city where they interpreted all of Dr. Seuss's houses and gadgets and kind of vehicles into a real 3D world with live action actors interacting with everything. And so the original idea was to do sort of this whole Rube Goldberg machine in 3D, which was going to be a metaphor for inside the cat's mind, which I got really excited about with my team of 3D animators and making this this whole kind of mechanism of all the titles chunking along conveyor belts and going up and down Escher-like passages. And then all of a sudden, we heard back from the studio and from the producer Mike Myers and the director Bill Welch, and they were like, this isn't what the film needs right now. And it was what they needed, and they explained is like when you go see a film like The Cat in the Hat, you want to be first brought into that world that that's like sitting on your mom or dad's lap, reading the book. Maybe it's like smelling the library binding, the paper, those funny Dr. Seuss drawings. You want to be brought back to that world first emotionally, and then to have it transition to this wonderful world. It's our job as in the beginning isn't to just plot people into this kind of fantastical, weird new world. And so that was a really big lesson for me, that it was more, what can you do to emotionally set up the film? We were kind of all getting excited about the sort of visual gymnastics we could do and kind of show off like a lot of, there's beautiful storyboards, I have to say. We were very excited about doing it, but it wasn't, the core. And then what was more resonated more at the beginning is and I'm really lucky we got the clearance to do this, is to alter even from the first frame of film, from the very first frame where we have the film studio logos, that we could Seussify them, and that just got everybody into that warm, fuzzy place before bringing them into that 3D world where we bridged it in we saw that flat kind of 2D animation go into the 3D. Mm-hmm. And then the Pink Panther is an incredible legacy. I mean, I've always, if you have a chance, look up all the old titles. The first Pink Panther is an incredibly great piece of like mid-century design / kind of animation of that time, modern animation. And it's really fun and clever, and it's funny things like the Pink Panther says ow, and then the OW becomes letters in somebody's names, and so like totally corny puns, totally into that. So this, version, and so the Pink Panther, as has an animated, even though it's a live action film, has an animated title sequence with the animated characters of the Inspector and the Pink Panther. And this has all been through its, I guess, since the 60s. And so, I'm building on this like incredible legacy of animated main titles. But in this case, the director in the studio, Sony and Harold Zwart, I think Ratatouille had just come out the year before. And so, there was my first boards actually, I had worked with a design team on making them, kind of a throwback to that mid-century idea because that's what I loved, But one thing that we had to do is kind of update that in a not clearly it's not a Pixar direction, but like seeing films like Pixar's beautiful backgrounds and matte paintings and the idea of the characters being in a more kind of 3D world, even though they're not, they're still cell. Definitely influenced the aesthetic, and then very much working as a cartoon, with. We worked with cell animators, but we designed the whole story and the way he goes around the world, and again, back to delicatessen, hiding the names inside the title sequence was a really fun bit of that. One thing I really had to work on is just the comedy level, like the kind of Tom and Jerry-ness of it. I had a lot of what I thought were clever transitions. I worked with two designers on these boards, Dana Yee and Arisu Kashiwagi. And we had what we thought were really fun transitions, but they're very, they're kind of like dry design humor. And, at one point the client said to me, just put a bomb down his pants, like you need to get a little bit more slapstick with this, and then he's got to stretch some more. And,
there's a metaphor in there. I love
exactly.
It.
So it was, really, working with cell characters, and they're not just graphic forms, they're actually characters. Like, the panther always has to be cool as a cucumber. The inspector's always got to be this fumbling for kind of messing it up and kind of getting wound up, and you have to really depict these characters as people know and love them.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a preference working with a legacy character or creating new, or do they just flex different parts of the brain, the creative brain?
Yeah, I think I love them both because one of the greatest things with working with either the Cat in the Hat or the Pink Panther is I knew these properties and loved them myself. So to be able to add to that, and to further that character and work with that material is fantastic. At the same time, starting from scratch, like a brand new television show, where nobody knows who the character is and you're introducing them, that's an incredible challenge too. I think, I like it both. I think both offer a lot of creativity. You might think you might be limited by the parameters of the existing character, and sometimes you are, but sometimes it depends on the filmmakers too. Like they want you to push it into a new direction or a new storyline, or and a lot of that, having that parameters of knowing who this character is, and something somebody who is so strong, they already have a story behind them, can often be an advantage.
And sometimes you just get to put a bomb down pants.
Yeah, or you can just put a bomb down their pants.
Okay, well, let's move to the next segment. These have all been opening titles that we've been talking about until now. And this next piece for The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is, in fact, an end title.
Yes.
Is there anything you wanted to say about this before we show this, or do you want to just...
Yeah, end titles have the same creative challenges as main titles in some ways because you're doing... a shorter condensed version of something, but they are different in that they are seen at the end of the film. So in fact, in some ways you have a little bit more freedom. You don't have to hold back something. Like for instance, one of the titles I worked on was Charlotte's Web, and I did not put the titles I did not put, as you would think, my first idea was to do this, but we didn't do this, is put the names and the title in Charlotte's Web, which is to some people is like a no-brainer. I once was with a bunch of designers. They're like, why is not the typography in the web? Duh, it's a spider who writes. But I couldn't do that because when talking to the director, Gary Winnick, he's like, the first time you see words in the web in the film, it's a hugely important moment for the story. I don't want to blow that moment by having the titles show the words in the web. The first time you can discover the spider can write is, a really key point. And so you have to remember that the titles really are part of a whole, the whole storytelling experience. You have to consider what it's doing in the whole arc of the story. You do end titles, you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff.
Well, particularly with Charlotte's Web, because it's for children. We all know, and we remember the title of the book, and it's got it in there. And anyone who's come to that story as an adult would probably know, but a kid wouldn't, and it's a different audience, so you wouldn't want to necessarily spoil that.
Yeah, exactly. And it would just take that thunder out of that that wondrous moment. Yeah.
So decidedly on Charlotte's Web, let's look at The Mummy. So tell us, I mean, it's gorgeous and so graphic. What was the concept here?
Well, it's an end title, and so I think that's a great opportunity, to just give the audience almost like a little gift at the end of the film, something that hopefully makes them want to watch all the credits, and but just recap the story a little bit. And this is sort of like the summary of sort of like the greatest moments in the story. And my co-designer Steve Fuller and I really were working with the idea of the Chinese brush paintings, because if you know this series of films. Or very many of these kind of films, they have a lot of special effects. They're incredibly lush photography. They've got the best special effects and so how do you compete with that? And the answer is you don't. We consciously stripped this down to be much more abstract, to use the brush paints, to use these sort of more of these transitions that would lead you from one place to another. And the idea that's almost like, what if we made this big, Chinese scroll painting that recounted what you just saw in the movie, almost like a myth. So it's more of like the ideas of these key scenes, and as if you saw, like when you see a Greek frieze of paintings or panels of Chinese or Japanese art that take the key parts of mythological history and just illustrate them. And so that was sort of like the impetus of doing it, in this brush style. Of course, the Chinese the story does take place in China, so that has a relation there aesthetically, and making these silhouettes and these graphic shapes that can move through scale and transition easily one to another in really fun ways that surprise you. You're, on one point you're on a face, but then that dark void becomes a cave or something like that. That's kind of the thinking that I think is really fun when you're doing this kind of sequence.
You really like transitions, don't you?
I do. Yes.
What about them is so interesting and powerful as a creative tool?
I think this is one of the reasons why I like film and why I like animation is that there's the surrealism that you can play with when you can change something unexpectedly from one thing to another. I think the idea of always as a filmmaker, you have the power to guide somebody's eyes. It's not like a book where they explore at their own pace, or a piece of architecture that they walk around. You're the camera, right? So you're their eyes, and so you can control what they're seeing, and you can then be in control of putting them in a situation that it was a face, but now it's a mountain. And so those kind of transitions to me are very cinematic. That they're kind of what the magic of cinema is kind of about. And I think now filmmakers, I think because of different kinds of techniques in film and in commercials and music videos, the audiences are getting more sophisticated, and they're almost even in video games as well. I think that the playfulness that you can get with the point of view and where the camera is and how things move from one from another can be, extremely playful, and that's a great thing, because what you ultimately want to bring to your audience is a sense of delight and surprise. And I think animation in particular is a great tool for doing that, because there's really no limits. A nose can become a building, which can become a parade. And if you do it, I do try to avoid the morph though. I do, yeah. I think that's a little bit of a cheat, but we can talk about that later.
You just mentioned video games, and you have done work with video game cinematics, and in fact, you mentioned that God of War titles came off the back of this.
Well, yeah, actually, the director of the God of War 3 video game, Stig, had seen this title sequence, and actually had then called us up and said, I don't know if you know the God of War PlayStation games, but they're incredibly rendered video games based on a character, Kratos, who is battling Olympians and all these creatures of Greek myth. And it's incredible. It's like very sophisticated game rendering. But what he wanted was some flashback sequences and a title sequences that were more based on Greek art or more abstract. It used kind of more of the because they were more like dream sequences and a little bit more surreal, wanted more of the thinking that came from a title sequence like The Mummy, where, again, you can find yourself in one place or another. It was more flat art that in a dimensional space. Obviously, for a game about Greek mythology, I was taking more from Greek art, like ancient Greek red figure and black figure vases and urns and things, but kind of a similar idea, but always... Another thing, just like aesthetically taking from this, I want to mention that I used my friend's father as a master calligrapher.
Convenient.
Yes, master Chinese calligrapher, Mr. Yuan, and he, so he did a lot of the calligraphy, like earth, or we have fire, water, the elements in there, and then just bringing in real brushwork and real elements, even though you're doing a digital sequence, I find is really helpful, because just because you're doing work in the computer, it's obviously you finish things in the computer, doesn't mean that your elements should always come from there. I think what's incredible about a computer is that you can mix up so many media. You can shoot something, you can overlay it with design, you can take a texture of brush painting, but then you can lay it into a 3D environment. I think that kind of hybrid imagery is incredibly exciting, and I love that we can do that now. And so when you're, I would encourage people in their own work to take from both, both the digital side, but also, analog, organic, real materials.
It's just a bigger toolbox,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next set of clips. I mean, we were talking a little bit about doing work in gaming, which is different than film titles, but you've also done some work in television.
Yes.
So the next two clips are going to be from TV. Before we see them, can you tell me a little bit about how designing a TV title differs from a film title?
Yes, yeah. The challenge is a little bit different, because when you're watching a film, the title is always in the same place, right? Sometimes it's the first thing you see, sometimes it's a scene and then the title, and then something follows after. And as a film designer, you always know, or you should know, what scene follows your sequence or leads up to your sequence. So it's very specific in the arc of a set story. When you're working on a television show, you're hoping that if it's a hit show, this show will run for years, and there can be all kinds of plot twists, characters, as we know, like get killed off now, or themes, take over. And so you're designing, I think you have to keep it more open-ended. It has to be more of the exciting thing is that it's more of a metaphor, it's more of a feeling or a tone for an entire story that is still unfolding. And so sometimes you can deal with like bigger ideas, and it doesn't have to directly relate to the scene that follows before or after. You're trying to capture with the showrunner what that mood is, and it may run for years.
Well, let's show that clip, please. So both pretty iconic.
Yeah, well, just to clarify, the last piece there was for South Park. It's for their latest season, their 17th season. So that was actually a job where you had 16 years of South Park history leading up to that. So it's more one of those, like you had said, a legacy sort of job, like the Pink Panther or something, where fans were very invested into it. And it's so funny to hear the reaction to it, because this is the first time they had done anything like this with a design, a 3D. We wanted to make it like one of those old stop motion cartoons. Like if you know the history of South Park, they started with them having cut paper stop motion little characters, and then of course now they do it in Maya, but they retain the paper texture and everything. So we built this little paper town, almost as if you would do it for the old Bass Rankin, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer or something like that. But we did it in CG so we could incorporate their characters. But the fan reaction was like totally split. Either they loved it or they hate it. Some of them were like, "Rae and Matt, you ruined the show. You run the opening sequence in 3D. You suck," Or other people were like, "Get over it."
Fans are outspoken.
Yeah, who knew?
Who knew?
Or some people were like, "They've always been on the cutting edge. They've always changed their main title for the past few years, every season, and this is just a newer version."
So what did they want? What did they ask of you?
They wanted just to update it for a new. The 17th season is amazing. They've been on that. The show's been on that long, and I think it's we played with some ideas actually about, again, making it 2D, 3D, or even bringing to the forefront. When we first did a set of boards for them, we even had some ideas that even had some of the Maya graphs, or like 3D sort of the flat. They do their characters flat and animated, but they put them in the space, but the ultimate, if you watch South Park, it looks like it's a flat piece of animation. And we thought, well, maybe we expose that, because they had earlier main titles that kind of did a nod to their stop motion. Like you'd actually see somebody like cut the paper out and stuff like that. So they've always been very transparent about their methods. But then we did this one frame that Rae really fell in love with. Alan Williams, actually, my collaborator on this project, did this beautiful frame where it was like this, snowy world. It's almost like that showed the town in a 3D environment, but the town was still, made out of little paper houses, as if a little kid had made them. And Trey and Matt just really liked the idea of, now they never had a title sequence that showed off the town, like really linked things and showed kind of the geography of the town. And it just so happens they're going to issue a South Park game soon, so there was sort of like some ideas about how the town would be put together, but it wasn't ever explored. And so that became sort of our story of going through the town, and South Park, even though it's such a funny show, is supposed in this idyllic sort of Colorado town, and we kind of envisioned it almost being like a what would be like if you had a little travel spot for it, and it's like kind of like welcome to South Park, and see this bus going around and see all the townspeople there. But really important. I mean, they are really, really, they're very. The aesthetic of the show is so strong, and it was all about like making sure it matched the paper textures of that they had developed all these years for the boys and the environments, and making sure that the buildings were true to the show, and then the South Park team actually animated all the little gags with created all the we didn't animate their characters, of course. We gave them these environments, and we talked about what would happen, and then they would animate all the little gags along the way.
And then the Boardwalk Empire piece is an interesting story in that it's another one of those pieces that what you initially conceived is not what you ended up with. Can you tell us about that piece?
Yeah, I mean, the show is a sort of, I always like to say, an embarrassment of riches, because it's so lush. I mean, if you watch the show, the production design is amazing. It's a thoroughly researched show in the historical aspects. It takes place in the Roaring '20s during Prohibition in Atlantic City, so it's a time of a lot of change. It's between the two world wars, or they don't know there's another one, so it's after the first
Bad news,
World
guys.
War, and Prohibition really changed the fortunes of a lot of people there, because the way the town was situated on the water made it really easy for smugglers to do a lot of operations there, and so that raised the fortunes of a lot of organized crime, which had ties to government, and it was Terry Winter, the creator of the show, liked to say that the Boardwalk was a microcosm of American culture. Everything that was happening in America at that time was happening there. Intense capitalism and consumerism, but then there was a gambling and this kind of underside of corruption, and there was like this clash of the upper middle. And lower classes and relations there, because people were finding it was like a new vacation destination for high and low, and so our original idea was to show off this boardwalk. I mean, they had built this gorgeous set in Brooklyn. I was living in New York at the time, and you go behind these shipping containers, and there was like this whole set, and not only was it like a set with like a taffy shop and a laundry shop, all vintage. You could shoot outside into the shops or inside out of the shops, which if you've been on any kind of like studio set, sometimes like you get all excited because they have like a main street, and then you go in the stores and like there's nothing. It's just like a shell. It's like this weird thing, but they built it all out with all these props and everything. And so the original plan was just to get on that boardwalk and not show the main character, Nucky, who's played by Steve Buscemi. He's kind of like this kingpin of the whole area. He's a part politician, part gangster. He just kind of runs the place. We were going to see it through his eyes and therefore not see him, or maybe we just see his shoes walking his territory, and we go from day to night and see, everything from snippets of showgirls to taffy makers to, the people walking up and down, the crowds, and, just do a portrait of the boardwalk. And then at some point, Terry and HBO and the production said, HBO in particular, which I have to kind of give them credit for pushing us in a little bit, is that they said, well, that's wonderful. We can see this beautiful montage. We had storyboards all detailing this out. But, we want something a little bit that maybe, provokes more curiosity, that more something, and this is what you never want to hear. You do want to hear it, but you don't want to hear it because it's like hard to hear, show us something we haven't seen before. And, HBO has a history, as you know, for some of their they've done amazing montages for some of their shows. And I was like, well, what's wrong? This is a perfect one to do that with. But they're like, no, I think we want something. This is a big, interesting show. And we just want to have a different approach to it. And so we went back, and I remember brainstorming with Tim Van Patten, who is also one of the producers and directors on the show, and Terry. And, we were like, well, what is like the central idea of the show? And, characters will come and go, but it'll always be around Nucky. So it's, he's like in the eye of the storm. All this change will happen in this decade, but he's somehow in the middle of it. In some way, he's often unscathed. He doesn't get his hands dirty. He's kind of the masterminds it. And is there a way to show that? And also, one of the things I've always asked myself when doing a title sequence is that, can this title sequence play in front of another show? And if the answer is yes, then I think there's more to do to make that title sequence more specific. I think a good title sequence, you can't put it in front of any other show. So, if you do a great police crime sequence and you can still put it in front of CSI, maybe you have to go dig a little deeper and think, oh, what can I do to make it really about that show? And so one of the things about this show was the influence of liquor, and particularly the sea, because the idea that all this change was seen through the lens of liquor became extremely important. That kind of differentiated this character and this place. And so we thought, well, what if we just see like the liquor like roll up from the waves, and it's almost like his future and his destiny. And so that became, it's a title sequence that asks more questions than answers them. And I think that's a important thing for being a title designer, is that you're not there often to be expository or to answer a question, but maybe just put it out there because the show's going to answer the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. And I love that he can never get killed off.
Yeah,
right?
I guess it's the job security for Steve Buscemi,
Game of Thrones
right?
action going on here,
Yeah.
right? Okay, on that note, I think we have some time for some questions. I cannot see a thing.
Yeah, I know.
So there are some microphones. If you would be so kind as to wait for a microphone, because we are recording this, and we'd love to get your voice on the recording, and so we can hear it. There's a question just right here with the red sweater. Yep, I think it's red.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier before that Stig Asmussen specifically hired you for God of War 3 because of your work on Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Have you ever encountered a situation where you felt creatively constricted because your client specifically said, oh, I loved your work on this, do that, but better or different? And if you haven't, what would you do in that such scenario?
Well, that's an interesting question. That particular, he was influenced by that, and it was great because I had a point of reference for what he envisioned those flashbacks to be, because his reference was very specific, not to duplicate it, but to take that thinking. And I think that's the key that I like if a client or a potential client comes and says, I liked what you did because of this thinking, as opposed to duplicate this style, because I always think one of the things that that drives my design, I like to think is the story and the concept, and so that the visual manifestation will come from that. I think one of my dual roles. I mean, I'm a title designer, but I also direct television commercials. I split my time between both. I'll often have a client who looks at another spot or looks what was done. For instance, I did a prologue for the film Zoom. It was all about moving through a comic book. And then Target agency, Peterson Miller Hooks, called one time and said, we love this sort of like moving through the comic book thing you're doing. Could you work on a Christina Aguilera spot where we want to make her into like a superhero, and we want to work with that. And that involved a live action shoot of shooting Christina and incorporating her into a different kind of comic book, but it was great because what they liked about it was the thinking of how things move with the frames of the comic book and the POWs and the kind of pop art aspect of it, but it wasn't like duplicate this. So I think it's great when it's used as a reference. There have been times earlier on where maybe sometimes things aren't aligned as much. One of my mentors is Kyle Cooper, who did the title sequence 7. And I remember after 7 happened, we get everything from cup of noodles to diapers who wanted a style like that. And see, it's like, no, but you see, this film was about a psychopath, and your product really doesn't have that same quality. So, it's difficult when that happens because then they just want to style. Sometimes they just want to style. But I think if you have a client who's recognizing it was the thinking you brought to it, I think it's great actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good point. We've got one down here in the second row. Oh, and there's a flashing thing up there. Yep.
Oh.
I would just like to say that the title intro for Human Target is sweet, and I really like it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. We had a flashing thing over here. Yep.
Hi, Karin.
Hello.
I wanted to ask you about your typeface choices. Do you ever have to have them custom made, or do you find like someone to design them? Do you have to design them? And how do you go about that? Or do you use ones that are pre-existing?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above. I mean, I usually start with something pre-existing, but sometimes modify it. Like for the Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, we took a serif font, but then we would make little adjustments so they would look a little bit more like Chinese chops, and incorporated some of that language into some ornaments, I guess we should say into that. Sometimes we did a whole exploration actually, a vintage type sort of for Boardwalk Empire, but actually the logo came, which we didn't end up using because actually one of the things that they really wanted is to not feel like a period piece, so we actually used more modern type to contrast that sequence, and also the end type was actually developed by HBO's marketing before before we got our hands on it, I guess. And then we've done custom. A lot of times we'll take a typeface and modify it to be custom. Especially for the movie's logo. I'm trying to think what else I showed here. Like obviously for the Cat in the Hat, it was the actual title. I think we came from the studio, but all the typefaces I can't remember if there was like a Seuss typeface, but I think we had to, really because of the Universal logo and all that, the way it does that in 3D, had to hand modify that. So it's kind of all over the map. I love hand-drawn type too. I think that's great. I think type, when you're a title designer, that's hugely important. I mean, the first and foremost, function of the title piece is to show the credits. And, I think, to ignore the type is to do yourself an extreme disservice. I mean, it's a great, and nothing teaches you how to kern more than seeing your work on a big screen. You're like, oh man, the A and the Y.
I love that you said that. I was like, are we going to get through a whole thing on title designs without talking about kerning?
No, it's like, you're like, check it 3 times.
Did we have up there, do you have a microphone back there, or are you just flashing your phone at me?
A microphone?
Well, they have like a little flashy wand thing, but I think he just used his phone, which was quite clever actually.
Hi, Ms. Karin. Just wanted to ask, I saw your presentation yesterday at the RGD, and sorry, back here.
Oh. Use your phone again.
Right.
Okay, I see you. Yes, you're standing.
So, yeah, I really liked the original concept that you made for Boardwalk Empire. And then what I like about the new one is, the use of the technology and all that, and the design is very cool. But as the audience of the show, when I first saw the first 2 seasons, I was like, it's like almost like at first it was not predictable what's going to happen to the original character Naki, but the original concept that you did first almost was more mysterious to the story. Was that a sort of decision like for the producers, or something that you suggested to them, that there's more mysteriousness to the story if you don't show Naki throughout the whole his face or his character on the original like the opening scenes of that sequence?
Yeah, no, it's funny because that design for the title was a total 180 from not showing this character at all and just showing him his point of view and his surroundings to actually just showing that character and none of the boardwalk at all. I think the first concept, it was I was getting really excited to shoot this boardwalk with all these extras and their custom this and that, and it was a very grand shoot. But I think I think just thematically, I think they wanted something, it was HBO who actually said, oh, let's not, and that's another thing that I think is important. It's like you sometimes don't want to do a title that duplicates what you're seeing in the show, right? So showing the boardwalk and avoiding Nucky would have been mysterious, and I still like the idea. For those of you who weren't there yesterday, I showed this animatic where, we were walking through the boardwalk and all its wonderful scenes, which you never see the man. And I still think that concept could work because the boardwalk is a unique aspect of the show, but at the same time, it really is about. I think they were missing that it really was about this man and it wasn't just about this location and this setting, but all these winds of change just like around the United States even.
But I think that I think what he's asking is pretty interesting in terms of a show with a lot of violence, a lot of corpses along the way.
Yeah.
Having him in the titles kind of gives away after a number of seasons that he's going to be okay. Like, I mean, we talked about this the other night about when Game of Thrones killed Eddard Stark, and I hadn't read the books, so there was no spoiler alert. I was just like, what? And by virtue of having him in there, it sort of tells a bit about what to expect in terms of the show. Do you think that? I mean,
I wouldn't put past them to do something. I don't know anything about the show.
Yeah.
These days, I mean, I wouldn't, because you can change an opening title sequence.
Right.
But I do think this is his story. Unlike Don Draper's for Mad Men, it is his story. This isn't about guessing about who's gonna, this is it. He's the center, and he, there are all these things happening, but he is the central character. And I think that's what they were a little bit missing in the first piece. That it was like this ensemble. A setting, but it wasn't as defined, and it wasn't, and maybe it was a little bit more to them conventional about, we'll set the stage, we'll show you, snippets and pieces, and we had bits of violence, we had what if, a bottle crashes to the ground, or, you see just little bits of the underside, like counterfeit money, a roulette ball, a gunshot, so there were little bits of actually seeing, but this, you don't see anything. There is no direct allusion to like the gambling in the mob or anything like that. And, there's something, there's a feeling of unease and change, but it's much more open-ended. And I think they like that idea and less, because, one of the things that's been brought out to me is like, it is about the environment, but you are about to see this beautiful environment at the minute it cuts to the show. So maybe is the title sequence better to be a metaphor or to show all these scenes? There's two, I think they were two equally strong ideas, but I think they went with one that was honestly it's just more enigmatic, and then maybe we'll serve them for a longer period. So remains to be seen.
Question here?
Oh, yeah. Hi. Okay, so your incredible body of work shows how title sequences are more than just words on a screen before a film. And so what, for you, do you think makes title sequences such a dream or aspirational project for designers, animators, motion designers?
Well, it's one of my favorite kinds of projects because I think it does flex the part of your brain that thinks, how to tell a story, how to think metaphorically. I love working with filmmakers. I love working with the directors and the producers of these films and of the showrunners of these shows. I feel they're very invested in these stories, and it's our job. When you're on a crew for a film, it's a limited time, and you're just trying to tell the best story you can in this limited amount of time, often with limited means. And I think the design challenge in that, the specific set, there are parameters. I think often good design comes out of parameters, and there are parameters for you to work with and to do something that again doesn't have to be literal. I think part of the best part about working in titles is that there is a sense of abstraction that you can have, at least the best ones. I'm always talking to my TV clients, like, you don't have to do the thing where you show somebody's face every time or have to show, I worked on a title for Rubicon with the late Henry Brummel, and he was great because he was like, let's not show the office, let's not show where they are. That's not that, you're going to see it as soon as the show starts. So let's have something graphic that, can speak to like the idea of a conspiracy theory or paranoia. How can we do that? Because that's really what the show is about, not the setting, not the literal things that you're going to see. It's nice to think a bigger picture, be a little bit more abstract and maybe because of that get to be more of the emotional core of a story.
That being said, if I could ask like a part 2 question to that, seeing how you've done everything from animation to live action, drama, comedy, is there like a dream project for you?
I think there isn't a title designer who would not want to do a Bond film. I don't think maybe I'm not British enough or something. That would be fantastic. But honestly, I love just working. Again, it's all about just having the relationship with the director or the filmmakers that makes a good, back and forth in a title collaboration project. I think that's, sometimes your dream projects come from the most unlikely places.
We have one up here.
Hi.
Could you stand up so we could see you in the darkness? Thank you.
Hi. Earlier you were talking about the differences between designing
Yes.
title sequences of movies versus end sequences. And I found that really interesting. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else you have to take in consideration between designing movies versus TV and what kind of differences there are.
Well, the one thing it's hard in television a little bit. It's sort of always a battle with the network or something. Is like getting the time on television sequence. I was very lucky with this Boardwalk Empire sequence because it's a luxurious 90 seconds. But HBO is very good about that. But other networks or other places, well, sometimes you'll get 30 seconds or you'll get 30 seconds kind of, and sometimes even like 20 or something. And it's hard to do a build. You have to think differently if you don't have that time to do a build in your sequence. What is it then? Is it mostly about going to be the title card, or is it going to, do you have to just make a story that can play? Because a 30-second arc is much different than like a minute 30 or a 2-minute one. I was something like Bedazzled or definitely Maybe they take their time, or even the Pink Panther, they take their time in like these 2-minute sequences, which is very rare for television. So there's definitely a time aspect to television that makes it a challenge. You're always trying to fight for those extra seconds because that's extra seconds they don't have for advertising or for the show. So it has to come out of somewhere. So that is a challenge of television for sure.
I think we have time for one more question if there is. Yep, right here.
Hi, I'm a graphic design student and I really love motion graphics, but like lately I've been trying to figure out how to get into that industry because it kind of marries illustration, animation, film, and graphic design together. What would you recommend to sort of get into that industry?
Well, I definitely think showing a reel or portfolio, like I would do a piece that you love and that shows the kind of work you want to do, or like the piece that got me in, I did an animated alphabet book when I was in school, and even though it was very cartoony, again, it was the transitions that intrigued people. Kyle Cooper to hire me as a designer for RGA, and but he could see that it was my thinking and the way I designed things. Again, it's not like you don't, it's not like the style. It's not like a particular thing you do that someone's gonna hire you for. But like you like to think it's your thinking. So something that shows your thinking and your aesthetic and maybe make a short piece, because we're always looking at reels and always looking at books. And I would also don't hesitate to, if you're a really good typographer and you've got beautiful posters, or you have paintings that you love, or whatever you think that is your strength, put them in your book or your on your site or your portfolio, basically, because all those things, when we're looking around, like some of the times I work with storyboard artists that one of my favorite parts of the process is doing a storyboard. I don't actually animate anymore. I used to when I first started, but it's been like a good, more than like 15 years or something, because I actually like working with people better than me. That's why this can all happen. But in animation, but I always like to work with Photoshop and do the storyboards, and you might work in this field and not animate, for instance, or you're maybe a brilliant animator, but maybe, it doesn't mean you always have to do the typography either. So whatever you feel your strength is, make sure you're real in your portfolio, even if it's not a motion piece, shows that off, because it's incredibly important, I think, to have people too with like just incredibly good design skills like composition, beautiful photography, layout, typography, because a lot of people make the mistake when they're working in motion that they think things are moving and I don't have to pay attention to that detail, which is totally false. Like if it's ugly, still it'll be ugly moving. I'm sorry to say that. And so, like if it's badly kerned still, it's not going to look better when it's got motion blur on it. It's just going to look like bad type with motion blur. So all those skills that you're learning in your design classes, bring forward and incorporate. The ideal thing is to have a piece that you love that you can show, but also supplement that. Don't shy away from showing what you think is excellent design in your portfolio as well. It doesn't have to always be moving.
Great. That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Karin. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to TIFF and RGD for this.
Thank you.